Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's ranking all of the episodes of Season 1 of Star Trek The Next Generation. So this is a new tradition and I am beginning right now. I am starting as I cover every episode of Star Trek. I decided that once I reach an end of a season, I cover a season of a particular show, I will then rank all the episodes because, hey, why not? Because I am keeping track of the ratings of each episode I go through, and I'm gonna do a top 10 of the whole show once I'm done, but that's just 10 episodes. I have all these episode rankings here, nothing to do with it. I might as well rank them all as I go by the season, to look at the season specifically, which is something I haven't done on my channel yet. Usually I just rank all the episodes in the entire show. And, I don't want to rank every episode. Sometimes I just do the top and the bottom. But I thought, hey, why not look at each season individually? Now, I've already covered the original series, so unfortunately I won't be doing that for the original series because that time has passed. But starting now with TNG, going forward for the rest of the coverage of TNG, and then on to Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise, if I even ever get there, I will be doing these videos after each time I finish covering a season. I will check in and do a video like this where I rank all of the episodes of a season. Now, as I've talked about on my channel before, I give each episode a rating between 1 and 10, 1 being the worst and 10 being the best. I consider ratings between 1 and 5 to be a negative rating, and ratings between 6 and 10 to be a positive rating, to varying degrees, because of course a 5 is kind of an okay bad episode and a 6 is an okay good episode. They're very close to each other, but in general that's the cutoff. 1 through 5 is bad episodes and 6 through 10 are good episodes. And looking at my ratings, or how I rated the episodes of Season 1 of TNG, I found there are 25 episodes in Season 1, because I'm only counting Encounter Farpoint as one episode, which is what you should do. And so there's 25 episodes in Season 1, and 15 I've gave negative ratings to. So they're bad episodes, and only 10 get positive ratings, which, that actually made me realize just how poorly I think of Season 1, because that's actually most seasons of television, the shows that I like, shows that I really like, and shows that I review will be overwhelmingly skewed towards the positive. We'll have the majority of the episodes being the positive. In fact, there's certain shows like Better Call Saul and The Expanse that I gave 0 negative ratings to. Every episode of the entire show got positive ratings, and there's other shows, when I'm thinking like Breaking Bad or BoJack Horseman, which only had 1 or 2 episodes with bad ratings. And so to contrast that with this Season 1, where the vast majority get bad ratings, does tell you how little I think of Season 1. And also, like I said, I rated each episode between a 1 and a 10, and the highest ranked episode for me in Season 1 is an 8. So I don't even go all the way up to a 9 or a 10 in this season, whereas I definitely do 1s and 2s, and it skews, so the whole season skewers more to the negative. And it's funny because I was just watching a video about how someone's pointing out how a lot of people really don't like Season 1, and they think it's maybe underrated and treated unfairly. But actually, I'm finding the opposite, having just gone through Season 1, is that I used to think of this episode higher than I actually think it is. Before I used to say that Season 2 was worse than this, but I think as I watch Season 2, I'm definitely going to change my mind about that and feel like, no, Season 1 is definitely worse. And I said that season 3 of Voyager is worse than season 1 of TNG. I don't know. I mean, I just am frustrated with season 3 of Voyager because a lot of people seem to like it, and so that makes me want to hate it more because I think that season's awful. But if I'm being completely honest with myself and comparing it to season 1 of TNG, I might have to say season 1 of TNG is worse, but I still say the first 2 seasons of Enterprise is worse than season 1 of TNG. I don't care what anyone says. Those are still worse. Picard season 2 is definitely worse. So yeah, Picard season 2 and Enterprise 1 and 2 is definitely the worst seasons of the franchise. But after those 3, honestly, I think I would have to put this season as number 4. Yeah, it's definitely down there as one of the worst seasons of the franchise. But anyway, let me get into the rankings. So as I normally do with these, ranking videos, as I said, I give each episode a rating between 1 and 10, so I'll be, doing the episodes in groups of those rankings, or those ratings. So a card will flash up that will say the number rating that I'm giving the episodes I'm about to talk about. So we'll start with that. Coming in dead last, my 1 rated episode, number 25, is Code of Honor, which should surprise no one, as pretty much everyone sees this as one of the worst episodes of the show, if not the entire franchise. Now, it didn't quite make my top 10 worst of the entire franchise. As I mentioned before, though, it would make a top 20 worst of the entire franchise. There's not much more to say about this episode. It's, incredibly racist. It's a decision to use entirely black actors putting on African accents to portray an alien race on the other side of the galaxy that's supposed to be this weird alien race, but it's just Africans. That whole aspect is extremely racist. But more than that, as I mentioned in my review, the music is terrible. Like, they got a composer from the original series, and it feels very 60s-ish and out of place. And the storyline is cheesy. You also have a bit of sexism thrown in for good measure. And and then you have like this ridiculous story with Yar being held captive and Picard having to beg for her back. Oh, would you please get my captive back? Like, that's dumb. Anyway, so yes, absolute terrible episode. Number 24, coming in as the second worst episode of the fourth worst season of the franchise, is Lonely Among Us. I always hated this episode so much. Like, I don't really see the point of it, and it's just cheesy and not done very well. It's about, an alien skipping from body to body. It seems very generic. And then Riker and Troy and Crusher talk about relieving Picard of duty, yet they let him sort of, I know you are, but what am I? He lets him do that to them. He's like, I'm not the one that needs to be relieved. You are. And they actually fall for that. What the everlasting fuck? And then they use, a specific technology called magic to bring Picard back to life after he beamed himself into space. Yeah, this episode's terrible. So next, also a 2-rated episode, we'll get to my number 23, which is The Battle. I think I dislike this episode more than most people. Maybe because it always gives me a headache when I watch it, because it had that weird noise, and Picard himself has a headache, so it makes me have I don't know. But the whole story, and again, this is when the second episode where they tried to make the Ferengis the main enemies. The Ferengi just do not work. And they come off as really cheesy and stupid. Bach in particular comes off as a cliche, terrible mustache twirly villain where he's like, "I will, Picard," and the whole episode, and I mentioned this before, this along with Code of Honor, I think, or maybe this even more so than Code of Honor, is the most syndicated feeling of the entire show, if not the entire franchise. And by syndicated, I mean, if you haven't watched, syndicated shows from the 80s, or early 90s like Xena, or Xena is probably a better example, even though that show's terrible, but there's like cheesy syndicated shows that are just flat and cartoonish, and this Star Trek Next Generation, even though as being a syndicated show, never felt like one except for this episode. Speaking of the Ferengi, we'll move over to my number 22, which is The Last Outpost. Yeah, this one was like slightly more entertaining to me than the battle, just because the plot of the Enterprise losing power and Riker trying to impress that Tucan guy was somewhat interesting. But again, the Ferengi just tank this episode, and the Ferengi were portrayed way worse in this episode. They were literally told by the director to act like hyperactive gerbils. I don't know why. The idea of the Ferengi was supposed to be a commentary on Wall Street. How is having like these short little troll-looking guys going, "I gave those words to the human"? How is that in any way, shape, or form a commentary on Wall Street? It's a complete failure, and these villains are just so cheesy, so stupid, and the whole aspect of Picard thinking it was the Ferengi that was draining the Enterprise, but it actually turned out to be the planet. And like that whole thing was handled really dumb, and the resolution was really stupid as well. With that, I just mentioned it as a positive, the con guy, but I actually didn't like the con guy overall. I don't know. I didn't really care about it. I didn't care about anything in this episode. So yeah, that's my number 22. So next, we'll get to my number 21, which is The Naked Now. A bad ripoff of an original series episode, where an original series episode that had a lot of humor, a lot of character, a lot of great aspects to it, and they just take that and make the entire crew horny, super horny, and wanting to sleep with everyone they could find. And then Wesley, takes over the ship in the rip-off plot of O'Reilly taking over the ship that is way more annoying and not as interesting. And you have Riker doesn't get the disease, even though he passes it on to someone else who passes it on to someone else, and he's still perfectly fine. Why? Anyway. So next we'll get to my number 20, which is Angel 1. It's really, I don't hate this episode as much as I think some other people do, but I really don't like it. There's no really positives of it. Some people, get caught up in how ridiculous it is that Riker's, wearing that silly outfit with the hairy chest. I didn't really care about that. I just thought the main plot about the whole thing about evolution or whatever, and Riker, sleeping with this woman who's a authoritarian dictator who's trying to execute people just for wanting equality of sexes, that's what I don't like. And there's a resolution, and the whole virus storyline was made no sense. Why didn't Crusher get the virus? They're never explained it. Being a doctor does not make you immune. In fact, she even inhaled Picard, the scent that gave everyone the virus. She said, "Oh, I smell that." Then you should have the fucking virus. Yeah, and the resolution where they decided to beam the or they didn't beam. They decided they let Beata decided to just put them on a isolated peninsula where they'll probably die or live in isolation. How is that a win? Anyway, don't like that episode. So next, we'll get to my number. What are we at here? 19, which is coming of age. Now, this, I think a lot of people may disagree with me on this one because I've heard a lot of positive things said about this episode, and it baffles me because I hate this episode. Like, the whole Wesley teenage, storyline of trying to, like, go and take tests was so dumb. Like, I think Wesley, I was about to say I hate Wesley as a character, but let me qualify that. I hate Wesley in season 1. In later seasons, he's not as bad, but he's unbearable in season 1. And so when they have an episode that focuses on him, that's going to turn me off immediately. But even then, the actual what happens in these tests is fucking ridiculous. Like, they just have like fake like an accident where Wesley has to save people. Like, what would happen if it was really an accident and people actually died? It would be their fault. And what if Wesley did something that he really thought it was an accident and people were dying? What if he did something that would like permanently hurt someone? Like, it's like playing those practical jokes that could backfire. Like, why would you do this? Why would Starfleet participate in this? And I don't buy that they would only choose one person out of these 4 people who are all clearly qualified. It doesn't seem that hard to get into Starfleet. Berkeley! Excuse me. Anyway. And, yes, I hate it. And, of course, Wesley would know. He knows he was going to be tested, so he shouldn't have been fooled anyway. But anyway, and then the B plot with Remick coming on board and being a dickhead was very cliche, very dumb, and at the end he's like, "Oh, I actually love this ship and I love your crew," and whatever, which is so stupid. So no, I don't like this episode, and I disagree vehemently with anyone who really likes it. But that's just me. Anyway, we'll get to my number 18, which is Hyde and Q. Yeah, did somebody say games? Like, this is not a very good use of Q. Definitely not a good follow-up to Q. And as I said, like, it sounded like an interesting premise that Q, forced the bridge crew to play games to reveal their character, but that's not what happens. He just has these weird animal thingies with muskets attack the crew, and then it gives Riker these powers, and then Riker all of a sudden gets an instant character change that is unbelievable, and it's supposed to be, oh, power corrupts. No, I don't buy that. And then Picard is wrong. Picard is wrong for not letting Riker use his powers to save a girl's life. He can save Wesley's life because he's the main character, but not a little girl who died in an accident. You're wrong, Picard. You are wrong. Anyway, let's see. What are we up to here? We're up to my number 17, which is data lore. Okay, yeah, this is another one. This is actually, many consider this the best, or one of the best episodes of season 1, and I, of course, very strongly disagree with that. It is an evil twin trope done very poorly. Now, granted, lore was used better in the later episode Brothers, and maybe that's why people look back on this fondly, because they introduced this character who became sort of ingrained in the Star Trek lore. But get it, lore? No, don't go there. Anyway, but the character himself is just, and it's cheesy when he takes over for Data and pretends to be Data, and he goes on the bridge and he's like, magnificent, or something like, isn't it beautiful? He's like, beautiful, isn't it? And nobody notices. Hey, Data, why are you acting like fucking Lord? And of course, you know who does notice? Wesley! Wesley is the only one who notices. And the time when we get the best line in the entire show, when Picard tells Wesley to shut up, finally, thank God, is a time when everyone else is being stupid and Wesley's the only one who can see the obvious. So it's frustrating. It's a terrible, terrible episode. I'm sorry. Anyway. We will get to my number 16, which is The Big Goodbye, which I also think is a really well-liked episode, which, granted, the trapped in the holodeck safeties turn off trope. This is the first episode that ever did it, so it wasn't really a trope at this stage. And no, I don't count the animated series as this is the first one that really did a trapped in the holodeck episode. And the main problem I have with this episode is that the whole aspect of being trapped in the holodeck, the whole aspect of the safeties getting turned off, and why the fuck did Picard decide to go in the holodeck and play around like hours before a very important meeting that could decide the fate of the ship? That is so stupid. But on top of that, yeah, I think the whole like threat of having the safeties turn off, and again, I went on and on and on about how it doesn't make any sense that an entertainment program could then turn and kill you. Like, I think that's a very huge flaw, and all holodecks should be discontinued immediately after this incident, but that's not what happens, because it's just contrived writing in order to create tension. And honestly, I think this episode would have been way better without it. I think had they just done an episode with, because it was somewhat interesting, of Picard, going around, this noir detective setting and pretending to be this detective, and the character interactions they could have done would have been great had they just continued it and just let it play out like a normal holodeck program. By having the holodeck malfunction, I think ruins the episode. And it shifts it and makes it more of a threat of a week, more of than a character story. And the bullshit with the Parada, yeah, again, like, I'm okay with them doing that, but not having Picard go in, being stuck in the holodeck and being late for it. I'm like, oh, he's gonna be late and whatever. That's why did you go in the holodeck right before? It's stupid. Anyway. So next, coming in at number 15, is Too Short a Season. This episode is fine, I guess. It's just the main issue I have with it is that it focuses entirely on a guest character. And I'm sorry, the actor who plays him is not very good. And the makeup they have on this character as an old man is terrible. And the props they had for this wheelchair, they apparently paid thousands of dollars for, and it didn't even move and fell apart. And they try to make commentary on the Iran-Contra controversy, and it really do a terrible job at it. It's not really relevant. I think some of the aspects are interesting, like the fact that the guy sold weapons to the both sides, and the terrorist wants his revenge on him. Decades later, apparently. I don't know what took him so long, but and at the same time, so it just so happens to have these magical de-aging things. And then you have the scene at the end that was a bit annoying with the villain being like, that's not Jameson, and Picard's like, it is Jameson. He's like, that's not Jameson, and he's like, but it is Jameson. That's not it went like that. I was like, okay, can we like move on with this bullshit? But yeah, so overall, I mean, not one of the worst episodes, as you can see with my ranking, but yeah, not particularly good either. So next, we will move over to my number 14, which is When the Bow Breaks. Yeah, another sort of... both of these episodes I just talked about, I think I would say are forgettable. For me, they're the ones I forget exist. And I'm like, oh yeah, that episode exists. This is the one where they go to this magical, mystical planet that everyone thought was a myth, and then they proceed to steal all of their children, not all of them, but some of their children, and try to negotiate with the Enterprise to give them something for the children to make themselves feel better. Well, meanwhile, Picard's trying to figure out a way to get the children back, but for them, it's completely off the table. And one thing I like about this episode is that it's a Wesley-centered episode, and he actually behaves as an actual teenager and not a Mary Sue boy genius who can save the universe. He's an actual teenager, and he, helps the other children cope with their situation. And that actually makes sense for a goddamn 14-year-old. And it's, and I think it's a good use of Wesley. But I think these Aldeans are being really obtuse and not hearing the Enterprise out when, they're saying, look, we can find a medical solution to your problem. And they're like, yeah, whatever, fuck you, I'm just going to steal your children. And it turns out that, yeah, had they stole the children, it wouldn't have solved the problems. The children would have been infertile as well. And it's kind of like, yeah, they're just dumbasses for the sake of the plot. But whatever. Anyway, next we'll move over to my number 13, which is Encounter at Farpoint. And my God, I think it speaks very poorly of season 1 that this episode made it this high in my rankings, because I always think very poorly of this episode. I do think this is one of the worst pilot episodes of Star Trek, and I think when I did my rankings of pilot episodes, I think this came second to last, maybe third to last, but I think it was second to last. Enterprise, of course, being last. But anyway, yeah, it was a very sloppily written episode with a lot of showing things off. Ooh, let's show off this ship that separates. Let's show off the holodeck. Let's show off these new characters. Let's have McCoy pop up for no good reason. And it was definitely it was originally written to be about Farpoint, but then Gene Roddenberry butchered and added this plot about Q, and you can kind of tell that these two plots have nothing to do with each other. And the whole thing with Q was kind of pointless. Why are they running and fighting and doing ship battles with an omniscient being? You're not going to win. That was kind of boring. I mean, but there are aspects to it that are good. Some of these characters they did introduce well, like Picard. You get a sense of who he is. And Q was an interesting concept, probably one of the better godlike figures Roddenberry created, but of course they would go on to do a lot more and better things with him later on. Yeah, but the ending with the jellyfish creatures, it was okay, but it's not that fascinating, really. It's at the end of the episode where Picard's no, I'm sure our adventures will be made way more interesting than this. And I'm I better hope so, Picard. Anyway, we'll move over to my number 12, which is Home Soil. This is basically the Devil in the Dark redid for TNG. But I think to be fair, they did do a much better job of redoing an episode than Naked Now did, but it's still not very good, and no point in redoing an episode. And it was a bit silly at times, the whole ugly bags of mostly water thing. But, I mean, I thought it was pretty intriguing at the beginning, I suppose, when they were trying to unravel this mystery of why, this guy was so uptight and what was going on with these terraformers. And it turns out that they were, about to all be annihilated. And thank God the Enterprise showed up to save them. Well, not all of them. That one guy got killed by the laser. But anyway, yeah. So it was somewhat interesting, but yeah, mostly just repetitive. So to get to my one and only 5 rated episode is my number 11, which is 11001001. This is another episode I think a lot of people like a lot more than I do. I thought it was fine. It was okay, like the whole thing with Minuet being this, perfect hologram who could manipulate Riker was like somewhat interesting. And the binars were somewhat interesting. I just find the whole plot, like, it was really fake stakes when they, like, set the auto-destruct and, like, they beamed to the bridge ready for battle, but it was just, like, these guys knocked out. And so it didn't really amount to anything. But the main issue I have with this episode is that the whole reason the binars are still in the Enterprise is so weak sauce. As like when Picard's like, because their planet was dying and they needed the Enterprise help, and Picard's like, why didn't you just ask? And the binars was like, you would have said no. And Riker's like, whoa, there we go, binary thinking, either yes or no. But no, I'm sorry, the chances of the Federation saying no to that are super, super fucking low. In fact, their chances of succeeding are way lower by stealing the Enterprise than it would had they asked the Federation for help. Yeah, because many things would have went wrong. In fact, had Picard just happened to show up for a happenstance, as they said, had he not been there, then they would have been screwed and their planet would be destroyed. It's dumb. It's dumb. But anyway, mostly an okay episode because, yeah, some of the aspects of Minuet and the binars and whatnot were somewhat interesting. So now, finally, we've come to my positive rating episodes. Top 10, only 10 episodes get a positive rating. But yes, the top 10 will be episodes I consider to be good to varying degrees. So we will start with my number 10, which is We'll Always Have Paris. Which, yeah, I thought it was an okay episode. I think the love story with Picard was somewhat interesting. Like, it wasn't the best. Some of the way it was handled I have issue with, but I think it was overall an interesting concept that he had abandoned his lover and without even saying goodbye when he was supposed to meet up, and it's something he always regretted, and he comes face to face with her, and then sort of dealing with the consequences of that, and then going on the holodeck and recreating the situation at the end. It was somewhat nice, but I think the B plot with the time distortion things, while it looked really cool and gave some cool scenes and some cool shots, was mostly just a throwaway anomaly BS, a threat of the week that really was resolved very easily and didn't amount to much. And so it's kind of disappointing that they didn't do more with it. But still, an okay episode. So then we'll get into my number 9, which is Heart of Glory, the first Klingon episode. And I honestly think I might have liked this episode more had I not seen the future Klingon episodes first, because the future Klingon episodes way outdo this one. It's like way better and way more developed. This episode does suffer a lot from season 1 itis. But it was definitely, especially compared to other episodes of season 1, it was definitely a lot more interesting. They did waste a lot of time at the start of the episode with the Geordi vision or whatever, and have them wandering through all this steam. I think so the episode wasn't paced very well, and then the motivation of the Klingons was kind of simplistic. Oh, we just want to live like warriors. But it had some really nice character moments for Worf, and of course is very noteworthy for being the first episode in the Star Trek franchise that really solidified Klingon culture. What we now think of as Klingons and their culture came from this episode. Mostly. I mean, there's some shades in it before here, like Star Trek 3, Day of the Dove, whatnot, but it's really this episode that solidified it. Or Worf's random speeches about how I'm a warrior, sir, in episodes before this, but really, it's this episode that solidified Klingon culture. So yeah, you do have to. It is noteworthy for that, and it was somewhat interesting. And just again comparing it to later Klingon episodes, it kind of pales. Alright, so now we get into my 7 rated episodes, and I'm going to start with a pair of episodes that I know everyone's going to disagree with me on. I think I like these episodes more than most people, and we'll start with my number 8, which is Justice. And I've heard a lot of people list this as one of the worst episodes of season 1, one of the worst episodes of the show. I think it's rated in like the bottom 5 on IMDb. Kind of like this episode. Now, granted, it is cheesy with the skimpy outfits and whatnot, but I like the concept of this prime directive dilemma where, and granted the specific of, oh, you step on the grass and we're going to kill you is a bit ridiculous, and the fact that Yar didn't figure this out when she was supposed to have studied their laws is unforgivable. She should be fired for that. But setting those things aside, it's an interesting dilemma where, and they had this weird alien god thing, because again, Roddenberry's obsessed with alien god things, but it's like floating in space and threatening the Enterprise, and so Picard has to, do they violate the Prime Directive to save Wesley? Because he's unjustly being killed, and these people think that their whole society is going to crumble if Wesley doesn't face justice. But of course, is it really justice when he didn't even know what the law was? And these idiots are like, oh, ignorance is no excuse for law. The fuck it isn't. But anyway, and I love Picard's speech at the end. I think Picard gives a really good speech when he talks about there can be no justice as long as laws are absolute. Fucking A, Picard. And that's really why I like this episode as much as I do. And I think you get some nice character moments with Crusher and Data and stuff as well. So I do think this is one of the better episodes of season 1. Sorry, everyone. Anyway, another episode people might disagree with me on, but maybe not as strongly, is my number 7, which is Haven. Yeah, I did like this episode quite a bit. I think this is one of the better Loaxana Troy episodes. It's the first one. I actually think she doesn't grate on my nerves as much as she does in later appearances, particularly in Deep Space Nine, which she had no business on being in Deep Space Nine. I will die on that hill. But more to the point, I thought it was kind of humorous, actually, the way, and they overdid it in Manhunt, which I'll get to next season, which was terrible, where they just repeated all the jokes of this episode. But for this episode, I actually thought it mostly worked with her, making Picard carry her every suitcase, or having this weird alien and plant thingy attack the person. One of my favorite parts of the episode is when Troy knocks over the things and stop with your petty bickering, especially you, Mother, and Data's please continue with the petty bickering. I find it most intriguing. That was hilarious. And then the whole plot with the plague-stricken ship that it turns out that they were psychically linked with Wyatt, who was supposed to be Troy's husband to be, but it turns out he was destined to end up with this other woman in the plague ship, and he was a doctor, so he would help him. I kind of like that. I'm kind of sappy for that. And speaking of music, I love the music in this episode. I thought the music was actually really good and enhanced the episode. So I know, minority opinion, not many people will agree with me there, but yeah, I like this one. So next we'll move over to my number 6, which is The Arsenal of Freedom. So this was a very, I think this was one of the best sort of action-packed or action-oriented episodes of the entire show, really, because Next Gen wasn't really known for its action. And I think it was pretty exciting, even though it was the basis for this episode is, these rogue weapons that are just operating by itself in a hologram, trying to get them to buy the weapons, and all Picard has to do is be like, okay, yes, I'll buy it, and that ends it. Like, why didn't he do that before? But it was still pretty exciting, and the scenes with Geordi having to take over the Enterprise and like prop up these other ensigns who were unsure of themselves. I like that. That worked for me. The Picard and Beverly stuff, even though it was supposed to originally be hinting at a romance, which it wasn't really, it was still good character stuff. And having Riker and Yar sort of be having to run away from these, unstoppable killing machines was pretty exciting. So yeah, I thought this was a pretty decent episode. So next, we'll get into my number 5, which is Where No One Has Gone Before. It is the episode most people cite as the best episode of season 1. I have it at number 5, so not quite the best in my humble opinion, but still a really good episode. It's definitely the best early episode, because I don't know if you've noticed, you'll definitely notice this when I get to my top 4, that most of the episodes I have in the positive rating are episodes towards the end of the season. As I talked about, I think the show actually got better towards the end when Maurice Hurley took over for Gene Roddenberry. And so, yeah, the top 4 are all episodes from the later season. And, so I think this is the best example of an early episode it's probably the first good episode of the show, that features the Traveler coming on board and, then going to a different weird dimension where the thoughts come to life, which I think this is probably the best example of Star Trek doing this type of storyline. I know they did it before with Shore Leave, which I hate, and they also did it later on with If Wishes Were Horses and Deep Space Nine, which I also hate, and I think they did it later on one of the newer shows. I'm kind of blanking on which one it was, but yeah, I think it's done best here. And I think it was really fascinating, like the Enterprise going to 3 galaxies beyond and in this weird space, all because of this Traveler thing. And they think it was this arrogant asshole who did it, but it was actually his assistant. That was cool. Of course, they had to prop up Wesley as, boy genius. But again, it didn't bother me too much in this episode. So, yeah, I pretty much like this one too. So finally we come to my 8 rated episodes, which is as high as we go. But we'll start with my number 4, which is The Neutral Zone. Probably another episode I like more than most people. It's the plot of the Romulans was kind of a B plot and didn't even feature that much. So I think the title of this episode is misleading, and it was meant to introduce the Borg, but that never came because of the writer's strike. So it kind of sits as a weird thing with the Romulans just saying they're back, we're back, da da da, which is kind of cheesy. But I actually like this episode more for the storyline with the 20th century guys. Now, granted, a lot of people have legitimate complaints about this, with Picard and Riker sort of just berating Data for saving these people's lives and actually wanting them to just leave them there in space to die, which is fucking heartless. And I agree with that. But what I like most about this, and in fact, this episode stands out to me as the main episode in the entire franchise that really touches on Roddenberry's vision for a moneyless future. And I love how this, stockbroker from the 20th century is seen as completely primitive and barbaric. And that's a message I 1000% can get behind. This is one of the reasons why I love Star Trek so much, why I was attracted to Star Trek. That is a message I completely agree with. And that's mainly why I like this episode so much. And plus, I just like the interactions with these 20th century guys. Other than, Picard and Riker being callous assholes. Other than that, like, I understand the reaction of, oh my god, these people are so barbaric, because I think that's great commentary on the greed that is rampant in modern day society, as it was intended to be. And I think it's very effective. But more than that, like, I find like that Sunny guy who's like just all lighthearted and going with the flow. That was, in his interactions with Data, was kind of funny. That was kind of cool. And then that other woman who was, felt depressed because everyone she knew was dead, and that's a very relatable storyline. And then Troy actually doing her job for once and making her feel better and finding her descendants, and that was lovely. I actually wish I would have gotten more resolution to these storylines. But so yeah, even though it has its gaping flaws, I still am able to overlook it because I love the message of this episode. As I said, I think it's the best episode in the franchise that actually deals with this particular issue of how they move beyond their greed and desire for possessions or for power, which is great. And I think any utopian future has to move in that direction, personally, and that's why I love Star Trek. So, next we'll get into my number 3, which is Skin of Evil. This episode, I think, is polarizing. There's a lot of people who really hate this episode. I always loved it growing up. It used to be one of my favorite episodes of the entire show when I was younger. Of course, as I grew older, I didn't like it quite as much. But it does have its issues. I think there's a lot of pseudo-psychology with talking about Armorist and why he's evil and what he's evil and his motivations. It loses me a bit when they do that. But the main point of there being this impossible foe who just easily kills one of the main characters without a second thought, to me that was actually done really well. And that really raised the stakes of the episode, and it did rank up the tension. I thought this is one of the more tension, suspense-filled episodes, especially of season 1. And I think they did honor Tasha with that hologram recording at the end, which I actually thought was very heartwarming. So I thought this was actually an effective episode. So next we'll get into my number 2, which is Conspiracy. Now I do think a lot of people will cite this as one of the best of season 1, if not the best. I very nearly made my number 1 as well. But I think the main issue I have with this episode is the fact that I think it felt like there was too much story crammed into a short amount of time, that this should have been stretched out over several episodes. And again, it ends in a cliffhanger that was never resolved, because it was also supposed to tie into the storyline with the Borg, but they never did that because of the writer's strike. But it was effectively eerie, and it definitely stands out, especially when you look at Next Generation as a whole, as it really stands out very different, very dark, much darker and more gruesome than any other episode. Even that one in season 7 when they all turn into animals or whatever. It's like they just explode this guy's head and have a creature like pop up in his body and swim in his innards. Like, I can't believe they aired that on TV in the daytime in syndicated television. Like, that's crazy. But yeah, the whole atmosphere of eeriness, I think, was very effective, with the different captains going to Picard, even the one he knew, talking about this conspiracy that Picard's at first very dismissive of, but then investigates and finds, that there's warrant to this, that there's this alien race trying to take over Starfleet, and it almost would succeed. So yeah, I did find this episode one of the better ones of season 1. So finally, we'll get to my number 1 favorite episode of season 1, which I had mentioned in my review of this episode that this was my favorite episode of the season, and that is Symbiosis. Now, this is another episode I know that I think is a bit polarizing. I know there's quite a few people who hate this episode or don't like it that much because of the preachiness of the "hey kids, don't do drugs." But for me, I just see that as just that one scene, and I don't think the scene is actually quite as bad as people make it out to be, although I do agree that scene should not be there and the episode would be better without it. But still, I don't hold it against this episode as much, but I think the better aspect of, I think this is what Star Trek does really well, and I think this is one of the earlier examples of Next Gen actually finding its footing and doing something interesting, is where it comes up with this interesting concept of these two alien worlds that are dependent on one another. One thinks that they're dying of an illness and they need this drug from this other world to survive, but in fact the illness was wiped out years ago, and the other world is just dealing them drugs to keep them, narcotics to keep them intoxicated. So the entire world full of drug addicts that are dependent on this other world of drug dealers. And that's a very interesting concept, and I love the different interactions between these characters that are on the Enterprise and how Picard has to sort of navigate these negotiations. And I think the Breckians, who are the drug dealers, definitely come off as, like, to me they come off as like these big pharmaceutical corporations or whatever, being very sort of stuck up and evil, I think, and despicable is a better word than evil. And you can definitely see that Crusher feels that way, that Crusher's the surrogate for the audience, that these people are disgusting and despicable. And so, yeah, I think that was because they're exploiting the drug addiction of an entire world, and they don't care as long as they get their profits. And that's why I think the analogy to the Sacklers and the Purdue is what I would draw to this, but that's just me. I know this episode came out before that whole incident, but still, that's, in retrospect, that's what I would say this really touches on the most. And that's fascinating. Now, a lot of people criticize the ending for Picard deciding not to get involved and just leaving them to go suffer withdrawals because they won't have ships to continue their trade with the other world. And I actually don't know how I feel about that. Usually I side with the Prime Directive, but in this case, I kind of side a little bit more with Crusher, that they should have at least gave them some aid to help ease the withdrawal symptoms, and that Picard is all hooty-tooty about the Prime Directive, but he was perfectly okay with defying it in order to save boy genius Wesley, which I think is a bit hypocritical of Mr. Picard, but still, I still find it an interesting concept. And by the way, Lower Decks vindicated Picard because his plan actually turned out to be okay. So anyway, that's it for my ranking of all the episodes of season 1. As I mentioned before, I will be doing this after I cover every season, because I think this is an interesting, worthwhile thing to do, and I will be beginning my coverage of season 2 shortly. But more specifically, coming up on my channel, Wednesday I'll be releasing a top 10 Star Trek actors revisited, something I released to my Patreon supporters a couple months ago. It's going to go public on my channel, where I revisit the video I did about where I ranked my top 10 favorite actors of Star Trek, and maybe revise that ranking a bit. And then Thursday, I'll be covering the latest episode of Lower Decks. Saturday, I'll be doing my top 10 favorite episodes of The Expanse. And then Monday is when we'll start my coverage of Season 2 with a review for The Child. So that's what's coming up on my channel. Be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.